show.
Brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals, I started reading an article last week. It was written by a woman who works for an organization. It's a voluntary statewide organization called the Nebraska Municipalities, the League of Nebraska Municipalities. They represent the cities. They do a lot of work, lobbying in the legislature. And the director had watched me operate and thought that there should be an article in their magazine, which was done. I started reading it last time. I had digressed on other matters, couldn't finish it. And there were people who had wished I would go ahead and read the article since I said that's what I was going to do. So the director had given a message where she kind of outlined it, but I'm going to skip that even. The title of the article that the lady wrote is The Importance of Being Earnest. Oscar Wilde wrote a play by that name. Oscar was very witty. He wound up going to prison because he was gay, and it was a crime in those days. He contracted an ailment, and some people think when he was in prison under those conditions, he died as a relatively young man. And the way he spelled the name Ernest, it was E-A-R-N-E-S-T. But there are people who've written national publication articles about me, and invariably they would title it The Importance of Being Earnest or The Importance of Being Ernie. So I decided I would write a little rhyme about the importance of being earnest, except that I don't put the A, not E-A-R-N-E-S-T, but spell it my way. It's very brief. Shakespeare said, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." The earnestness of Oscar Wilde. Brilliant Oscar Wilde proclaimed the importance of being earnest. Such importance does attach to the meekest and the sternest. My name being Ernest may ensconce me in that tribe, not surprising to the Oscar principle I subscribe. Being frank and earnest, though I am constrained to say, my name sounds the same, however, it does lack an A. With or without that A, as sure as 4 + 1 = 5, bearers of the earnest or earnest name are able to thrive. When considering basic elements, here is what is telling. Quality and worth inhere in essence, not in spelling. So even though I spell it differently from the way Oscar Wilde did, earnest is earnest. And some people used to call me Ernest the Furnace because of my blazing oratory, as they called it. But I'm going to go ahead and get through this. I'm not going to digress anymore. And this is, as I said, in the Nebraska Municipal Review, the trade magazine of the League of Nebraska Municipalities. Looming large on the horizon for anyone seeking to understand the complex dynamics of Nebraska's legislature is one man. He is the only Black member of the legislature, and certainly its most controversial, a fact that bothers him not in the least. Since 1970, he has represented the 11th legislative district, which has more Black people than any other district in the state. At age 62, old to be a young, spry 62 again, turned 63 July 10th, Omaha Senator Ernie Chambers has some gray in his hair and beard, but otherwise looks remarkably unchanged from photos taken 3 decades ago. He is lean, muscular, and fit. He shuns suits and ties, preferring to wear his trademark jeans and short-sleeve sweatshirts that reveal biceps built through years of weightlifting. He does not drink alcohol or smoke, and he often reads and quotes from the Bible, even though he professes not to believe in any religion. He has been a tireless, passionate voice in the legislature for 30 sessions, serving longer than any other living state senator. And since then living Senator, I forget his name, Warner, had been there longer than I had. While he was alive, he was in the legislature longer than I, but after he died, I became the longest serving, not only living, but even longer than Warner had served. Just to explain that. His integrity is unassailable, and his theoretical style, his rhetorical style is unmatched. His zeal for society's poor, forgotten, and marginalized is unwavering. His wit and humor are as legendary as his stinging rebukes and filibusters. When asked to characterize his lawmaking style, Chambers gave a one-word response: effective. Fans and critics alike speak of his mastery of the legislative process and its rules. Quote, "I don't give away trade secrets," he said, smiling. "Everything I do in the legislature, though, is in a fishbowl, so everybody has the opportunity to watch everything that I do and see how I do it. And they've had a chance to watch me for decades." He compares himself to a capable, successful illusionist. "Maybe I'm like Houdini. You can put me in a box and in chains, and when the box is open, I'm gone," he said. Unlike every other state senator's office, Chambers does not have his title and name above the door by which you enter his office. Only its office room number, 1107, appears there. As you enter his office, you see stacks of papers, newspaper clippings, file folders, and books heaped everywhere, completely obscuring desks, tables, and chairs. And then you see Chambers' well-known weightlifting set. His artwork, mostly protected by brown wrapping paper, leans against walls and bookshelves. If you're lucky, he'll show you some of his drawings, but he does not display them. His longtime legislative aide, Cynthia Granberry, talked about the meaning behind certain elements of a portrait Chambers drew of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Chambers gave Kennedy Onassis green, animal-like eyes and a vampire tooth, which he said symbolizes a harder, far less glamorous woman than was seen in her public persona. During the rare hour-long interview, the always engaging Chambers shared his views on a wide variety of subjects, some of direct interest to municipal officials, including his philosophy about local government and its relationship to state government. Quote, "I think local government often gets in the way, and people in the legislature have allowed those local governing bodies and the officials in them to get the impression that they are on a par with the state, but they're not." Chambers said this firmly: "They are created by the state, and they have the powers that the state bestows on them, and they carry out some of the functions that the state has chosen to delegate to them, but they are not the equivalent of the state. They do not have the same power to tax or do anything that the state has. The Nebraska Supreme Court has pointed out that the state creates cities. The state can abolish them." I think that people need to see clearly that the paramount power in Nebraska is the state. The legislature, being the body that produces laws, is supreme. All of these other subdivisions and entities, which would include naturally the cities, the school districts, and the county boards, have to be put in their place and kept in their place. They have to show more regard for the state and what its prerogatives are. If the legislators are going to allow themselves to be kicked around by counties, by cities, by school districts, then you're going to have utter chaos, and the legislature will never be able to put together a coherent program of government. Chambers said local government officials understand his philosophy and his approach, and as a result, they approach him differently from the way they do other state senators. "They don't come huffing and puffing and dictating and ordering me to do anything," Chambers said. "Nobody does that to me. But they do it to these other senators, and these senators run scared. That is why people lack respect for the legislature," he said. "It's not the things that I do," he insisted, noting that even his detractors will come to him for help because they respect his knowledge of the law, legislative rules, and bill drafting. When asked to discuss his legislative accomplishments, Chambers declines with a quip, quote, "I'm modest, but usually I'm too modest to say that I'm modest," unquote. Among his top legislative achievements was the passage of legislation to provide for district elections for Omaha's City Council, the Douglas County Board, and the Omaha School District. Before district elections, Blacks were not elected to these governing bodies. He sponsored the resolution in 1984 to impeach Attorney General Paul Douglas, which stemmed from the legislature's investigation into the collapse of Commonwealth Saving Company. The resolution was adopted. He criticized the practice of apartheid and succeeded in passing a statute that called for the state to divest public funds from companies or financial institutions doing business in or with South Africa. He was later invited to speak before a United Nations committee about the subject. He also sponsored the legislation that repealed those statutes after apartheid was abolished. After it was abolished, Nelson Mandela was elected president, and then the state could allow investments in companies doing business in or with South Africa because the state-sponsored segregation was gone. U.S. Supreme Court case. In 1983, Chambers helped bring a case to the U.S. Supreme Court that ultimately resulted in the elimination of a paid chaplain position in the legislature. Volunteers now do the prayer, but this is not satisfactory to Chambers, who wants to see the prayer at the beginning of session each day eliminated. Get your salvation in church, get your legislation in the legislature, and the two should never mix. In 1984, he helped bring a case to the Nebraska Supreme Court to win per diem expenses reimbursement for the state senators. And recently, he successfully challenged an Omaha City ordinance allowing for cameras at intersections to catch drivers running red lights. I'm scampering right along. He stirred controversy in the National Collegiate Athletic Association, known as the NCAA or NCAA, when he proposed turning college football players into paid state employees, and he worked to restore full scholarships for injured women athletes. Interestingly, incidentally, or surprisingly, these athletes are unaware of what I did that would benefit them, but such is life. Chambers prefers not to look back. Quoting from a song, he said, "That was yesterday, and yesterday's gone." Instead, he focuses on what, in his view, is yet to be accomplished. There still is so much to be done that I cannot look back on things that I have done and really take pleasure in them, because there are still so many people who hurt and nobody cares. There is no way to give them relief. And of course, there are his ongoing legislative efforts. He is a staunch opponent of the death penalty and has fought for 30 years to abolish it. He has offered legislation allowing gay men and lesbian women to marry members of their own sex. He is pro-choice and has consistently resisted efforts to place limitations or restrictions on a woman's right to abortion. I was doing this when everybody was saying that it was crazy. But when my mind tells me I have an obligation, that's what governs me, not what other people think or say. Quote, "That's why people in my position who try to do things that are often unpopular have to realize that our victories never stay won," Chambers said. "We have to continue to fight to hold them. There's a possibility they can be taken away, so we have to always take a long-range view." Chambers is perhaps best known for his filibusters. This activity frustrates many of his colleagues because it often delays or derails legislation unrelated to the bill being filibustered. And inevitably, It raises troubling questions about the delicate balance in a legislative body between the rights of the majority of senators versus the rights of a minority of senators, especially if it's a minority of one, such as Ernie Chambers. I didn't care what kind of rule they put in place. I didn't care if all 48 of the white people were against me. My motto was, if Alibaba can handle 40 thieves, I can handle 40 white people. And then I'd tell them, this is my legislature. You all are my folks. They didn't like that, but what could they do? Look ugly, get angry, get juices running through their system that's going to shorten their life. They're playing into my hands, aren't they? But anyway, I said I would not digress. Quote, Chambers claims his role in defeating legislation he opposes is more valuable than his role in passing legislation he supports. Prevention is better than cure, he said. So here's what I look at. You have a very high cliff and there's a sheer face that is about, well, there would be a fall of about 1,000 feet, let's say. It would be better to put a fence around the rim of the cliff to keep people from falling in the first place than to build a hospital or a cemetery at the bottom. So I try to keep a lot of bad things from happening in the first place. Chambers said he does not believe that his efforts at stopping legislation from passing harm his efforts to pass legislation he often supports. I don't look at it as a trade-off, he said. If what I see as being very important is to stop a bill, and I've got bills that I want and they'll kill those, well, we cross that bridge when we come to it. Jesus said, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. Therefore, take no thought for the morrow. So I do what's in front of me to do, because for all I know, after I get done stopping this bill, I may croak and never get to that other thing in the first place. I can only live in the instant. He said he must do what he believes is right at that moment, rather than considering which colleague will be angry or might withhold support for a bill Chambers sponsors. Well, that might be why I'm more successful than these other people, he said. They do know, if they know nothing else about me, that I am for real. What I say, I mean. They know I mean it, but they also know if I change my mind, I'll let them know. And they know that my mind can be changed if I'm given enough evidence to achieve that. And then I thank them for improving my education. That makes it very easy for me. No matter how many setbacks I have or how great the odds are against me, I'm going to be what I am. That's the easiest kind of life to live. So I don't get heart attacks, I give them. Almost in spite of himself and against his instincts, Chambers said he genuinely cares about the legislature as an institution. Quote, unfortunately, I've fallen into that. I never thought, and I mean it, that I'd feel this way about the legislature as an institution. It's not our government as Black people. It's not our institution. We did not create it. It does not serve our interests. However, Chambers said, he has served a long time and is aware of the good that can be accomplished through the legislature, and he does not want to see it demeaned in any way. I don't want to see it playing second fiddle to the other branches of government, he said. We control the purse strings, and that's how we exercise oversight. We need to seize that power and make use of it. From Chambers's perspective, outsiders are not at liberty to criticize the institution. Quote, family can say things about family, but outsiders do it at their peril. I have developed that institutional concern. When asked if there were any colleagues with whom he especially enjoyed working, Chambers named one person, the late Senator Terry Carpenter, at whose funeral Chambers served as a pallbearer. He wanted it that way, his wife wanted that way, and Carpenter had made it clear to another senator that he wants those SOBs, and Carpenter used that kind of salty language, to know who my true friends are, and they don't live in Scotts Bluff. He wanted me to be a pallbearer. I was, and I dressed like I always do. Terry wouldn't have wanted it any other way. And some white woman, there was a photograph taken, clipped it out and wrote on it, "How disrespectful to dress that way. You ought to go back to Harlem where you live." Well, she's so dumb, she doesn't know that Harlem is not in Omaha, Nebraska. But anyway, that's white people for you. Let me continue about Terry Carpenter. It was during Carpenter's tenure that Chambers held the only committee chairmanship he ever had, serving as chair of the Government, Military, and Veteran Affairs Committee. Quote, "Terry was somebody without equal, and to put anybody else in that category would be an injustice to Terry. And even though he has been gone a long time, I still don't think of him as dead," Chambers said. Excuse me. Chambers, who holds a history degree and a law degree from Creighton University, has earned no more than $12,000 a year as a state senator, and that was only after lawmakers were granted a raise from $4,800 in 1988. He used to be a barber. He doesn't have time to practice that profession any longer. Why does Chambers work so hard for so little? "I'm very selfish," he said. "I do the things that I do because I am very uncomfortable in the presence of other people's suffering. So I do what I do to give me peace and security and serenity. I'm doing it for those selfish reasons, and other people happen to be the incidental beneficiaries. If I could manage to get enough religion so that it wouldn't bother me to see other people suffer, I probably wouldn't do as much as I do." A glimpse into the past also offers some idea of what drives Chambers to work as hard as he does. He has lived most of his life, except for a stint in the Army, in Omaha, the city in which he was born. His father was a minister, and he was one of 7 children with 3 older and 3 younger siblings. Quote, "That's why I'm so well adjusted," he mused. "I can deal with the old, the young, and the in-between," unquote. As a child, Chambers described how he faced an overt racism in school. "I was created by white people. When I was a child in grade school, all I ever had were white teachers, and they allowed things to happen where the white kids could laugh at me, mock me, and the teacher would join in. She was the one who read the story Little Black Sambo, and when the little white kids laughed, she was the one who did not stop them. So maybe if they hadn't been so unfair to me when I was that small child, maybe I wouldn't be the man I am now that they must contend with." Quoting from Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein, Chambers said, quote, "The monster said, 'You are my creator, but I am your master,'" unquote. Earlier this year, Chambers said he owns the legislature, a comment that rankled some of his colleagues. But Chambers said his fellow senators would not have considered it a personal affront to them as individuals if they had known that the expression was rooted in literature. Quote, "Sometimes they don't understand what really is behind my words," he said. "White people made me, but now I'm their master, and they cannot do anything with me. When they built this monster, they failed to include a mechanism of control, so now they can't control me. I control them." One of 2 registered independents in the officially nonpartisan body, the other is Senator Ron Rakes of Lincoln. Chambers is highly critical of both major political parties and said he believes the political climate has changed for the worse during his time in public office. Listen to this description, and this was 22 years ago. "Each session, I say it's so bad it can't get worse, but it has gotten progressively worse. I think there's more hypocrisy and posturing by politicians because the goal is not really to serve the public welfare, to seek social justice and fairness for everybody, but rather to get elected. So they put on these false fronts of being concerned about what they call family values or traditional values. The Republican Party is always doing that. But when you wind up with public scandals, they invariably involve a Republican. Chambers' favorite term for Republican. There was a Republican just the other day who got kicked out of the legislature in Idaho or Utah, one of those deeply Christian Mormon states, for having sexually abused an employee. He was a Republican. I think he got 20 years and must serve at least 8. A Republican gets in a position, abuses it, but that's that. Let me continue. So these politicians put on these false fronts of being concerned about what they call the family values and so forth. The Republican Party is always doing that, but when they wind up with public scandals, they invariably involve a Republican. Chambers says he sees a meanness on the part of people who call themselves Republicans. This meanness, he said, translates into a desire for harsh punishments, government intrusion into the most intimate and personal aspects of people's lives, and a desire to put pain and suffering on women, children, the poor, the mentally disabled, and the imprisoned. On the state level, he said, there's a tendency to reflect or imitate actions taken in Congress, which he said means he does not see in the Nebraska legislature people who are independent thinkers. They are monkey see, monkey do. That goes now from Ricketts right on down. Whatever the monkeys in Omaha see, the monkeys doing in Washington, that's what they imitate. They even use the same terminology, the same language, the same body language, the same gestures, everything. Monkey see, monkey do. Become a Republican and you can be a monkey too. But continuing. When it comes to those people who call themselves Democrats, I cannot always tell from the positions they take around here which party they belong to. Chambers said he agreed with avowed segregationists, the late Alabama Governor George Wallace, on the subject of the two political parties. There's not a dime's worth of difference between the two. And I add, especially as far as Black people are concerned. And Wallace is a person that I was talking about one day in the legislature. I'm not going to digress too long. And I said, he is famous for declaring not only the position of Alabama, but white people in general, not every white person, white people in general. Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And there was a Black member of the state patrol, about 6'6" and 260 pounds or so. He said, I was in the hallway and I thought I heard George Wallace, and I looked in there and it was you. He said, I never heard George Wallace sound so much like George Wallace than you did. He said, in fact, you sounded more like George Wallace than George Wallace did. But anyway, let me continue. I'm skipping some things. As a result, Chambers said, very little meaningful discussion of the profound issues facing society will take place. Instead, there will be bickering about trivial matters. We don't go to the root causes of problems. We never penetrate to the core of an issue. And too many of my colleagues are given their marching orders by people outside of the legislature, either a lobbyist, a special interest group, and with a lot of them, the Catholic Church. And that was something unheard of, somebody going after the Catholic Church before I did it. But I always had facts and evidence. A lot of these senators are Catholic, and they represent the church, not state senators representing the interests of the state. So my job gets harder each session. Chambers maintains that pro-choice advocates have become increasingly timid over time, leaving him to question the strength of their convictions. No, they got intimidated. They were told they will not be elected and so forth. That stuff never meant anything to me. I didn't come into that office begging for it, and I wasn't going to beg to stay there. Quote, now, when those matters come before us, I expect to have to handle them virtually alone, he said. I don't look for much help from any of them. Handling things alone is perhaps part of the life of a man who lists his occupation as defender of the downtrodden. Generally, he said, in a capitalistic society, there always will be the haves and the have-nots. Members of the have-nots or the downtrodden have changed somewhat during his time in the legislature, he said. For example, farmers are suffering far more today than they were in 1970. Quote, I used to try to explain to them that the day is going to come when things are going to be very bad for you, and you all vote against things that would benefit Black people and poor people, he said. But when your day comes, I'm not going to do to you what you do to us. I'll help you. And as it turns out, I have helped the farm sector, but they did not deem themselves to be among the downtrodden in those days. In fact, as I've said before, when the nut really got tight, they put together a petition from farmers around the state to have me go to Washington to represent them to Congress, not become a congressperson. They wouldn't vote for me for that, I'm sure, but to represent their interests. See how they are? They'll turn to the devil himself. But to them, I was worse than the devil because they get along very well with the devil. They didn't get along well with me. Burmese python. He even viewed a Burmese python as a member of the downtrodden, he said. Some idiot had one and got bitten and wanted to have it killed. A 12-foot, 50-pound python. I read about it in the newspaper. I bought the snake from him. It was at the Humane Society. And I showed the people at the Humane Society the sales slip, and I got the snake, took it to the zoo, and they found a home for it. Even though I've always liked snakes, I did not know that one would actually be among the constituency that I would be able to rescue. So I tell people my constituency consists of those with 4 legs, those with 2 legs, and those with no legs. And Cindy, who works with me, says those with 8 legs too, because I don't kill spiders. But anyway, Chambers said he has done many things to benefit people who have contempt for him, but their contempt does not disturb him. That's the way people are, he said. And when you get into politics, you cannot have a thin skin. You cannot do it because you're looking for people to be grateful or to even understand what you do or where you do it. If a person is going to do this kind of work that I'm doing for as long as I've done it, you better do it because you think it's the right thing to do, and let that be the reason. Some of the people with whom he has worked, such as white women, have realized that he does help them, he said. They've got good jobs. They should not have to come to somebody like me for help, based on what I'm sure their attitude toward me is, because I'm the devil personified to many white people. Invariably, they seek him out, he said, because they know he will help anybody who needs help and that he can get things done, although he cautions people against having too much confidence in him. They think I can pull rabbits out of hats, even when I don't have hats, he said. The fact that I've done it on occasion has worked to my detriment. Even though I'm glad I can help people, it causes others to think that there's nothing beyond my ability to accomplish. But there are some things I cannot get done. I cannot even get the death penalty abolished. That's the one thing that is going to always hang over my head to signal failure as far as my being in the legislature. Not to say that nothing I have done has value, but the death penalty is something the state ought to be ashamed of, but I haven't been able to persuade enough people to feel that way, and that defines, to me, failure. Although in a broader context, I don't reckon failure in the way that people do. It's not being unable to get done what you set out to do. Failure is when you don't do what is available for you to do, regardless of the outcome. If you do what is available to be done, no matter what the outcome is, you are not a failure. The effort failed, but you are not a failure. Continuing. My time is rapidly going by. And if I don't finish this, I'll finish it next week. It's a long article. Chambers did succeed in 1979 in persuading enough of his colleagues to pass legislation to abolish the death penalty, but then Governor Charles Stone vetoed the measure, and there were not enough votes to override the veto. Look, and then it goes on the highlight of his legislative career. I'm going to stop reading this article here. It's a nice place to take it up. And I have here something that was published June 3rd of 2007, which was my last year in the legislature. And it was on the front page of the paper. You can't make it out, but you can see, I think, that it's a very large picture of me standing at my desk because I never sat down. And the headline is, as the legislative session closes, we look back on what we have learned. And that's the large headline, what we have learned. Senator Ernie Chambers listens to the legislature debate on May 22nd, his bill designed to prevent discrimination in the workplace based on sexual orientation, something that I fought for during my whole term. And yet there were some white homosexuals at that building on 24th and Lake who had very negative things about me because they had no understanding or awareness of what I fought for. And I fought for their rights harder than they did. But see, they can be racist also because they're white first. Many senators cited Ernie Chambers as the source of lessons they learned, and there's not a lot here. Senators old and new share lessons culled from the past. You may think the learning curve was steep in the state legislature this year because term limits brought in 22 new senators from all over the state. You would be right, but seasoned senators say they learned a lot too. In a survey of senators, both new and experienced, they wrote about lessons, everything from the effects of term limits to the civility and collegiality on the floor to the importance of being prepared. Several mentioned the valuable instruction from the senior member of the legislature, Ernie Chambers, who served 37 years. This is before I was term limited the first time. I was being term limited this time also at this point. Even though he did it primarily for the benefit of new senators, Senator Shimmick said that everybody learned from Senator Chambers and was entertained. I learned, and we all learned from Senator Chambers, who serenaded us, read poetry to us, wrote poetry, told biblical stories, recounted history, provided lessons in constitutional law, and explained the rules and procedures of the legislature, said Lincoln Senator Diana Shimmick, the second most senior member with 19 years. Senator Arnie Stootman of Platte Center, who has been around 7 years, said he also continued to learn from Chambers, who reads and understands the majority of bills that will affect, in one way or another, everyone in Nebraska. Senator Kent Rogert of Tacoma requested and received a seat next to Chambers. He learned from his neighbor how to slow down legislation with certain motions and propose amendments to make bills better. Even those who are your political and personal opposite will be your ally many times, said Rogert. Then here's a comment from the lobbyists. Lobbyists who represent special interest groups inhabit the rotunda during the legislative session. Here's what one said, and he was the top lobbyist. There were sea changes in the legislative body, but we didn't see any diminution of the work product or in the ability to get things done. This session showed that we have an amazing ability to adapt. There was a movement of unseasoned senators to veterans in a short period of time. And get this, one thing has not changed. the individual domination of Senator Chambers, that has not wavered, that has not diminished. He put his mark on bills. He slowed things down, pieces of legislation to look different because of his influence. And then there is some other material that I might read next time, but I'm not going to get off into something that I cannot finish. I will just kind of digress for the last 3 or 4 minutes here. As I've said, it's a poor car that won't toot its own horn. I did not spend a lot of time telling people what I was doing. People do not read. They don't pay attention. Some people even now don't know what I did in the legislature, wondered why I stayed there as long as I did, and don't realize that in some respects, it cost me to be there. I went every day. I even went on weekends. And when we were in session or out of session. And I worked with members of the other 2 branches, the governors, which is the executive, and the Supreme Courts, which would be the judicial. And in most instances, they didn't want the people in their given branch of government to know that they were working with me. They would give me information. They would see something about to happen that shouldn't. And because they had insider information, if I took it up, they would know that somebody on the inside gave it, but nobody thought that anybody inside one of those entities would work with me. So when I came up with the information, they suspected that somebody had told me. But believing that nobody would work with me, nobody would dare speak out of school, they figured that I was just a genius, which may be true. But I'm not above acknowledging that I got information, that I got assistance from other people. That does not diminish me. What would diminish me is if I took credit for something for which I was not due credit. Now, where credit is due is the fact that I would take the information and run with it. I would stop bad things from happening. I would prevent one branch or the other from doing something that would be hurtful to the public by pulling the cover in the beginning. And as soon as somebody knew it, then whichever department it was or branch, they would disavow it and say they never intended to do it. But then the whistleblower, well, we can't say the whistleblower, the whisperer would come to me and say, Ernie, they know somebody had to tell you because we're the only ones who knew, but they'll never dream it was me, and I know you'll never tell on me. That's the way I was. My word was my bond. They could trust me when they didn't trust the Lord. If I said I'll do something, I would. They say the Lord said he was going to do something, and it never happened. That's not a boast. It's to try to give perspective. And because I play by the rules, and my time is just about up, I will have to say, as the canary said, when told that the door to the cage was ajar, I'm out of here.
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.